In part 1 of this series, we traced the terrifying blueprint of the Modernist Project. We watched how the abstract ideals of the Enlightenment, the obsession with categorical order, mathematical certainty, and linear progress, jumped from the pages of philosophy books and became concrete, steel, and corporate hierarchies. We looked at how we build a perfectly rational cage that produces deep, irrational human misery. But a machine this unnatural does not conquer the world without a fight. Along the way, brilliant minds saw the bars of the cage being forged and screamed warnings to the public. They were the critics, the heretics, and the tragic prophets of our modern alienation. Yet today, their warnings are buried, their voices neutralized, their critiques absorbed into the very corporate systems they tried to dismantle. To understand how the cage defends itself, we must look at the early 20th century, where two Titan sociologists, among others, stood up to document the psychological and intellectual violence being done to humanity. The first was Georg Simmel. Simmel didn't just look at the physical structures of the modernist city and the rationalized workplace. He looked at what they were doing to our inner lives. Simmel argued in his 1903 text, The Metropolis and Mental Life, that the hyper-calculated, relentlessly transactional environment of the modernist world forces the human ego into a state of permanent self-defense. To survive the sheer velocity of sensory overload and the cold, unfeeling nature of a completely monetized, planned society, Simmel warned that human beings are forced to adopt what he called the blasé attitude. The blasé attitude is the exact emotional dissociation you must perform just to endure your corporate job. It is the numbness you cultivate to sit through meaningless corporate town halls. It is the calculated cynicism you use to survive superficial networking sessions where everyone treats each other as objects to be exploited for career advancement. Simmel warned us that this environment would turn us into calculating machines, stripping us of our capacity for genuine, unmeasured human connection. So how did the Modernist Project silence Simmel's warning? It didn't ban his books. It did something far worse. It naturalized the trauma. The practical architects of modern management looked at Simmel's description of the detached, cynical, calculating modern worker and said, "Perfect. That is exactly what we need." The machine took our survival mechanism, our emotional numbness, and rebranded it as professionalism. Today, if you show genuine, unquantifiable human emotion, grief, or vulnerability in the workplace, you are penalized for lacking emotional intelligence or failing to maintain a professional veneer. The cage absorbed Simmel's nightmare and made it into a job requirement. While Simmel was tracking the destruction of our psychology, Karl Mannheim was warning about the total destruction of our intellect. Mannheim looked at the rapidly expanding corporate and state planning apparatuses of the mid-20th century and noticed a terrifying split in how humans use reason. He separated rationality into two distinct types: functional rationality and substantial rationality. Functional rationality is the optimization of means. It is the ability to execute a series of actions perfectly to achieve a predetermined goal with maximum efficiency. It's the realm of the project manager, the software engineer, and the operations consultant. Substantial rationality, however, is the capacity to think deeply, ethically, and independently about the goals themselves. It is the intelligence that asks, is what we are doing actually good? Is it just? Does it serve human flourishing? Mannheim's ultimate warning was a dark prophecy for the modern white-collar worker. He argued that as a society becomes hyper-organized and functionally rationalized, substantial rationality is completely paralyzed. When you enter a modern corporate bureaucracy, you are explicitly told not to think about the why. Your job is downscaled to tiny, hyper-specialized lanes. You are handed a set of KPIs and told to optimize them. You become a functional functionary, incapable of independent moral judgment because the system has relieved you of the responsibility to think. How did the Modernist Project silence Mannheim? By using the bureaucratic filter. It created a world where substantial rationality, asking why, is treated as a literal waste of billable hours. If you stand up in a corporate meeting and ask about the deeper ethical alignment or human purpose of a project, the system immediately filters you out. You are told, "That's out of scope for this call," or "We need to align with leadership's directive." Mannheim's critique was stifled by making independent thought an operational inefficiency. But the rebellion went far deeper than sociology. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, three radical thinkers tore down the entire intellectual foundation of the Enlightenment. The French philosopher Paul Ricoeur called them the masters of suspicion: Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud. Before these three thinkers, the Modernist Project claimed that reason was a neutral, noble, and objective light, leading humanity out of darkness. Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud looked at that clean, rational veneer and declared it a lie. They argued that our conscious, rational thoughts are just a mask, a beautiful illusion hiding deeper, darker, and unconscious forces that actually drive human society. The first master of suspicion was Karl Marx, and his target was the economic foundation of the project. Marx blew the whistle on the idea that modern corporate or legal structures are designed for universal human progress. He argued that the rationality of the modern workplace is nothing more than an ideological smokescreen, a superstructure built to protect the economic interests of the ruling class and justify the radical alienation of the human worker. Marx showed that the modern organization strips you of your creative agency, separates you from the final product of your labor, and treats your life force as a mere commodity to be bought, sold, and squeezed for surplus value. How did the Modernist Project defeat Marx's suspicion? Through institutional absorption. The modern corporation realized it couldn't stop the human desire for unalienated, meaningful, and communal work, so it decided to commodify it. This is the birth of corporate culture. The system replaces genuine human solidarity with free snacks, open-plan offices, beanbag chairs, and mandatory team-building retreats. They look you in the eye and tell you, "We are not a company. We are a family." It is the ultimate Hegelian meat grinder, taking a radical critique of economic exploitation and turning it into an HR onboarding slide designed to make you work 60 hours a week without complaining. The second master of suspicion went even deeper, targeting the very moral core of the Enlightenment, Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche looked at the modernist obsession with rules, bureaucracy, and objective institutional structures and laughed. He declared that there is no such thing as neutral, objective rationality. Underneath the clean, polished workflows and the bureaucratic systems of modern society lies one primal reality: the will to power. This is the desire to dominate, to categorize, to control, and to force the messy chaos of reality into absolute submission. Think about the next time you are placed on a performance improvement plan or forced to undergo a 360-degree peer review. The organization frames these tools as objective, data-driven methods to help you grow. Nietzsche exposes them for what they actually are: exercises in pure psychological domination. It is the administrative will to power forcing you to bend the knee to the corporate collective. And how did the Modernist Project silence Nietzsche? By weaponizing rebranding. It took Nietzsche's concept of the Übermensch, the hyper-individualist who breaks free from the herd to create their own meaning, and twisted it into the ultimate capitalist archetype: the disruptor CEO, the venture capitalist, the hustle culture influencer. The system took a philosophy meant to shatter institutional conformity and turned it into the grind-set propaganda, convincing you that the ultimate form of human freedom is to exploit yourself for 100 hours a week to hit a corporate metric. The final master of suspicion attacked the Cartesian myth of the completely rational human actor from within: Sigmund Freud. Descartes claimed that the conscious mind is the master of its own house. I think, therefore I am. Freud shattered this illusion by mapping the vast, terrifying continent of the unconscious. He argued that human beings are not rational clockwork devices. We are boiling cauldrons of dark animalistic drives and primal anxieties. Our conscious reason is just a fragile ego, desperately trying to navigate these primal forces while being crushed by the rigid moral rules of society, the superego. Freud's warning was clear. If you trap human beings inside a hyper-rational, sterile, and emotionally castrated environment, the repressed trauma of the unconscious will eventually erupt in profound psychological sickness. This is the precise diagnosis of modern office anxiety. The corporate workplace demands that you show up as a perfectly contained, sanitized, and emotionally flat variable. You must swallow your anger, suppress your grief, mask your anxieties, and perform a bizarre ritual of permanent corporate enthusiasm. Freud shows us that this absolute repression of your true internal reality is precisely what causes the epidemic of modern white-collar misery. But the Modernist Project didn't ignore Freud. It hired his family. In the 1920s, Freud's own nephew, Edward Bernays, took his uncle's theories of the unconscious mind and sold them to Wall Street. Bernays realized that if humans are driven by unconscious desires rather than rational thoughts, you can manipulate their behavior by hooking your products into their deepest psychological neuroses. This was the birth of modern public relations and mass advertising. The machine silenced Freud's warning by turning his diagnosis into a weapon. Instead of freeing the repressed human psyche, the corporate state used Freud's insights to create a multi-trillion-dollar marketing engine that intentionally triggers your insecurities, your desires, and your fear of exclusion, ensuring that you remain a hyper-compliant consumer by night and an exhausted corporate functionary by day. As the mid-20th century progressed, the cage ceased to be purely a human construction of bureaucrats and managers. It evolved into a technological entity. The French philosopher Jacques Ellul looked at this explosion of systems and issued a terrifying warning. The machine was developing its own autonomous logic. Ellul introduced the concept of technique. Technique, he argued, is not merely machinery or software. It is a total mindset. It is the relentless, systemic search for the one best, most efficient way to execute absolutely any human activity. Critically, Ellul warned that once technique is unleashed, it becomes entirely autonomous. It stops serving human needs and begins forcing human beings to adapt to its operational logic. Think about how you interact with the modern corporate tech stack. Look at how software platforms dictate the absolute rhythm of your working life. You do not use these tools to liberate your creativity. You alter your natural human behaviors to feed clean, formatted data into the software. If a customer interaction cannot be neatly cataloged into a drop-down menu, or if your creative project cannot be perfectly segmented into a rigid ticket, the system treats it as if it does not exist. The tools have become the masters, and human workers had been downscaled into manual interfaces designed to keep the automated software fed. How did the Modernist Project silence Ellul's warning? By framing all technological expansion as an objective, unassailable good under the banner of innovation. If a piece of corporate software makes your job twice as abstract, twice as frustrating, and completely drains your agency, you are never permitted to critique the tool itself. If you complain, the system diagnoses you as the problem. You are labeled as resistant to change and subjected to upskilling or change management workshops. Technique silenced Ellul by rendering itself unquestionable, making the refusal to bow to software look like a primitive rejection of progress. By the late 1950s, the warnings of the early sociologists and the masters of suspicion had been completely bypassed. The Modernist Project had metastasized into its ultimate form, leading to the rise of total state and corporate planning. Watching this disaster unfold, a group of German intellectuals known as the Frankfurt School, most notably Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno, wrote the ultimate obituary for the Enlightenment's promise. In their foundational text, Dialectic of Enlightenment, they argued that reason had been completely hollowed out. leaving behind only what they called instrumental reason. Instrumental reason is not concerned with truth, justice, or human dignity. It treats everything and everyone as a mere tool, as a means to an end. Under the regime of instrumental reason, the modern organization becomes a mindless monster. This is why your organization can hire management consultants to execute a mass layoff via a cold, pre-scripted conference call. The consultants aren't evil people. They are practitioners of pure instrumental reason. They aren't allowed to ask the substantial question, is it ethical to destroy the livelihoods of thousands of families to bump up the stock price? They are only allowed to solve the instrumental equation. How do we cut operational expenditure by 20%? How did the system silence Horkheimer and Adorno? Through the creation of the culture industry. The Frankfurt School warned that capitalism would eventually industrialize art, entertainment, and thought itself, turning dissent into a consumer choice. But it was their colleague, Herbert Marcuse, who mapped out the final golden trapdoor of this consumerist cage. In his 1964 masterpiece, One-Dimensional Man, Marcuse explained that advanced industrial society had created something insidious, a comfortable, smooth, reasonable, democratic unfreedom. Marcuse saw that the system no longer needed to suppress rebellion with violence because it could simply satisfy our material desires. It created the ultimate pacification strategy, the golden handcuffs. The modern corporate job offers you a salary, stock options, private health insurance, and just enough disposable income to buy high-definition screens, luxury meal deliveries, and curated vacation packages. The machine explicitly trades your existential peace, your time, and your creative autonomy for material comfort. You become too exhausted from the corporate grind to revolt, but far too comfortable to ever risk leaving. Your thought becomes entirely one-dimensional. You lose the capacity to even imagine a radically alternative way of organizing human life. The machine silenced Marcuse by mastering the illusion of choice. The market offers you tens of thousands of streaming options, 50 brands of coffee, and endless variations of consumer goods. The cage convinces you that because you have total unbridled freedom as a consumer, you must also possess freedom as a human being. It therefore obscures your absolute systematic subjugation as a producer. As we moved into the late 20th century, the mechanisms of the cage became entirely invisible. The explicit tyranny of the 19th century factory boss holding a stopwatch was too loud. It invited open rebellion. The Modernist Project needed a more subtle, psychological way to enforce standardization. Enter the French philosopher, social theorist, and literary critic, Michel Foucault. Foucault analyzed how power under the Modernist Project evolved from sovereign power, a king executing people in a public square, into disciplinary power. Foucault argued that modern institutions, asylums, hospitals, schools, jails, and factories all share the exact same structural DNA. Their goal is not to punish, but to normalize, to shape human behavior through constant surveillance, classification, micro-assessments, and examinations until the human being becomes a highly compliant, docile body. Foucault brought back Jeremy Bentham's architectural concept of the Panopticon to explain how modern society operates. The brilliance of the Panopticon, Foucault noted, was that the inmates never know exactly when they are being watched, so they must act as if they are being watched at all times. This is the ultimate diagnosis of the modern corporate HR apparatus. The modern organization has completely internalized Foucault's disciplinary power. It is found in the 360-degree feedback review, where your colleagues are transformed into micro-wardens, evaluating your behavior against the standardized matrix of corporate competencies. It is found in the peer-to-peer surveillance of public instant message channels, where every response must be carefully curated to signal alignment with corporate values. You are under constant algorithmic visibility. You don't need a boss standing over your shoulder anymore because you have successfully internalized the corporate warden. You police your own tone, your own expressions, and your own thoughts out of a perpetual subterranean anxiety of being marked as non-compliant. How did the Modernist Project silence Foucault? By framing this absolute invasion of the human psyche as support and psychological safety. The organization takes these terrifying mechanisms of psychological normalization and packages them as benevolence. Performance improvement plans are framed as support structures to help you succeed. Competency frameworks are sold as transparent career pathways. Psychological profiling and personality tests are introduced as tools for self-discovery. The cage silenced Foucault by making its chains look like wellness benefits packages. This brings us to the contemporary phase of our captivity. Previously, Foucault's disciplinary Panopticon was still tied to physical spaces. You could eventually walk out of the factory gates, leave the office building, and go home to an unmonitored life. But at the end of the 20th century, the French philosopher Jacques Deleuze realized the cage was undergoing a radical mutation. In his prophetic essay, Postscript on the Societies of Control, Deleuze argued that we are transitioning away from disciplinary societies and into societies of control. Deleuze noted that the old disciplinary enclosures, the school, the factory, the office, were breaking down. Power was no longer localized in the physical building. Instead, power became fluid, continuous, and digital. In a disciplinary society, you finished one stage and started another. You graduated from school, you went to work, you went home. In a society of control, you never finish anything. Look at your phone right now. Look at your life. This is Deleuze's nightmare perfectly realized. The boundaries between work and life have been completely obliterated by the digital infrastructure of the Modernist Project. Through software platforms and email clients installed on your personal device, your office is no longer a place you go. It is a continuous network that stalks you to your dinner table, your bedroom, and your weekend. Under the guise of the Agile framework, you are trapped in an endless sprint that never actually reaches a finish line. You are subjected to continuous training, permanent upskilling, and real-time algorithmic performance tracking. But as the digital network expanded to enclose our entire reality, it produced an unprecedented crisis of human mental health. And it is here, in our current era, that the late British cultural theorist Mark Fisher delivered the final, crushing diagnostic critique of our condition. Fisher called this total saturation capitalist realism, the widespread suffocating sense that capitalism is the only viable political and economic system, making it literally impossible to even imagine an alternative to it. Fisher looked directly at the modern epidemic of white-collar anxiety, depression, and burnout, and he exposed the system's ultimate psychological crime, the privatization of stress, whereby the psychological impacts of relentless high-pressure environments are framed as private medical issues rather than systemic problems. When the continuous, boundaryless network of a modern corporate state drives you to a state of total psychological collapse, how does the cage defend itself? It pathologizes your suffering. And the crowning victory for the project? Dissent itself has been completely weaponized into a corporate metric. If you are burned out by this endless digital surveillance, the system doesn't suppress your frustration. It invites you to post about it on social media. It turns your burnout into a viral piece of content that builds your personal brand, which makes you more attractive to another corporate employer, who will subject you to the exact same loop. The machine has become so sophisticated that the act of complaining about the cage is now just another way to optimize your value within it. In Part 1, we saw how the architects of the Enlightenment set out to build a rational world of perfect freedom and human mastery. In Part 2, we have seen how this very project systematically crushed, co-opted, and digested every single intellectual rebellion that tried to stop it. The contemporary misery we face inside modern organizations is not a personal failure, and it is not a temporary trend. It is a 400-year-old machine running exactly as it was designed to run. The system took Simmel's emotional dissociation and called it professionalism. It took Mannheim's warning of intellectual paralysis and called it operational scope. It took Marx's critique of alienation and turned it into corporate culture. It transformed Nietzsche's individual freedom into hustle culture, weaponized Freud's unconscious via public relations, and turned Ellul's technological tyranny into innovation, transformed Marcuse's critique into the luxury trap of the golden handcuffs, hid Foucault's Panopticon inside HR support systems, deployed Deleuze's digital network to ensure that you are never off the clock, and privatized Fisher's diagnosis of collective mental illness into an individual medical defect. The Modernist Project built the cage and then used our own psychological defense mechanisms to lock us inside from the interior. So where does this leave us? Recognizing the architecture of the cage is not about finding a cheap, easy escape route. There is no three-step corporate strategy to fix a structural crisis that had been compounding since the 17th century. But there is an immense power in clarity. Once you realize that your workplace exhaustion, your alienation, and your anxiety are not personal deficiencies, but the intended outputs of a massive historical engine, something inside you changes. The system loses its power to make you feel guilty for your own suffering. The cage is total, it is rational, and it is built to survive our anger. But the one thing it can never truly calculate, control, or optimize is the quiet, stubborn refusal of the human soul to believe that efficiency is the ultimate purpose of existence. The first step to escaping the machine is remembering how to ask the one question it can never answer: why?